Hello, this video is going to be about the Parkland shooting, or rather the repercussions and the movement of young people against guns in America as a result of the Parkland shooting, and no doubt of others. Also, I'm going to mention Count Dankula. Not that he has anything to do with what I'm going to talk about, just that I want to keep his name in the public eye because it's important. Actually, there will be something that will link Count Dankula to this a little bit, so I'm not being strictly accurate saying he has nothing to do with it. Okay, so let's start. I wonder how many of you have heard of the Children's Crusade. To my astonishment, there are people watching this video in all sorts of places outside the English-speaking world. More power to you, and thank you very much. But you might not have come across this legend. Well, we're not sure how much of a legend it is. There are two stories of children's crusades emanating from 13th century Europe. And they always involved charismatic teenagers. Now, I suppose some of you have heard of Joan of Arc. That's a slightly different one. She was also a charismatic teenager, but I'm talking about another situation altogether. This is charismatic teenage boys having visions of Christ and deciding to change society and bring in the millennium by leading troops of children from, in the one case, Germany and in the other, France, on a movement to retake Jerusalem from the Muslim conquerors by simply walking there. In both cases, the leaders, these kids, were convinced that the Mediterranean Sea would part when they got to the coast, in one case of Italy, in the other of France, whichever, and that they would simply walk to the Holy Land led by God, in most cases to convert the Muslims and bring about, I don't know what, the end of days, I suppose. In both cases, the story goes, the children were kidnapped by the adults who were supposed to be helping them and ended up being sold into slavery in North Africa, or shipwrecked on boats that weren't up to the job of crossing the sea. These stories have been taken as a historical reality, and they were regarded as having truth. In the 20th century, people started questioning them, and now we don't really know what happened. Most of the contemporary sources are unreliable, and the rest, well, they are very much post hoc and depend on legend and elaboration. So it's difficult to know what was going on. The 13th century was, in any case, a time of great upheaval. Nevertheless, there is probably a kernel of truth in there. There were certainly popular crusade movements or religious movements of various sorts, not necessarily just children, involving adults and whole families. They were frequently described as the wandering poor by people who didn't think much of them. And it's almost certain that they were trying to give their lives some meaning by reaching on this earth for the ideal promised to them by Christianity. But the story as told of children heading for the Holy Land, or indeed of following the Pied Piper, does tell us something about the Western attitude to children, and especially teenagers. For instance, you don't hear of children's crusades in the history of Islam, or indeed in Indian or Chinese cultures, and that's for a very good reason. In Indian, Muslim and Chinese cultures, children are kept well under control. In Islam, any boy who was inclined to fight the good fight was immediately trained up and taken into the army, and that applies to many who were not inclined to fight as well, because by doing so their military glory would increase the wealth and prestige of their tribe or clan. In Chinese culture, boys were given the instruction to get an education, pass the government exams, and bring glory and political power to their families. In India, boys were told to go out and haul water to support their parents. But in Christianity, each person has to seek his own salvation, and supporting your family, while commendable, is not actually the aim of your life. I quote, I think it's Luke, isn't it? If you come to me but will not leave your family, you cannot be my follower. You must love me more than your mother, father, wife, children, brother, sister, or whatever. Yes, and even your own life. And if you can't do that, you're not my disciple. Yeah, and that's the basis of Western culture. It's what made Western culture the success that it is, by the way. If you're bound by tradition, family ties, and concerns about what other people think, then generally speaking, you don't progress. It's usually the renegades that have propelled things forward. I'm not saying ditch your parents, by the way. I'm just saying that Western culture says there's a limit to family responsibilities. And we can see what can go wrong with that characteristic in the stories of the children's crusades and the Pied Piper. In every case, the stories show how the kids set off on a fine adventure and then get swallowed up by betrayers, usually adults. People with life experience know that this is what happens with children, but children know that they know it all. There's something else that these stories show up. We have, in the West, a particular view of the innocence of children. Now, anyone who's brought up children or who has taught them knows very well that children are vicious little savages who would cut your throat for a Cadbury's cream egg given half a chance. And they need socialising. I think the church got the idea that children are innocent little angels because most of the people running the churches never got married. But then the religion of Jesus itself constantly talks about innocence right from the very beginning. However, even though the church bigs up the innocence of the choir boy or the charismatic purity of the child preacher, most ordinary people know there's a dark side to this. I was put in mind of it with the children's crusade that's going on now in America with regard to gun laws. As I keep reminding people, I'm British and I am very comfortable with the lack of guns surrounding me. I'm not sure I'd be happy myself with the responsibility of a firearm. But in the United States, it is different because it's in your constitution. I disagree with it, but when you start messing around with the constitution of your country, you are on a slippery slope. And once the guns get taken away in direct contravention to that constitution, who's to say what's next? Free speech? Just look at what's happened over here in Britain when they started chipping away at British common law, which is the equivalent of the constitution, but slightly more vulnerable. It was the bedrock of our legal system until the Labour Party decided they knew better in the 1990s and started chipping away at it. Hashtag Count Dankula. I'm mentioning that because I want to keep his name out there. I'm sure the sentencing was delayed until the 23rd of April in the hope that the public will have lost interest by then. I beg you, don't forget. But anyway, he's a good case in point. Gun laws are part of the Constitution of the United States, and I don't see how it can be changed, although there might be some modifications to who can own what type of weapon. But the emotionalism of children is not going to make good laws.